All right, so there's a new sheet coming out today. Don and looks like Dad have a couple, and the sheet you're getting today will be for next week. That's what we typically do. You take that home, look at it, study that new section of Matthew chapter 6 because we're in the Sermon on the Mount. And then next week when we come back, we'll take a look at these notes and then have new notes for the next week. Now, you will, if you don't have a copy, there are extra copies, I do believe, in the back of today's lesson for the Sermon on the Mount. And that should be lesson number 9. Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 18 is what we're covering today. We're going to try to cover these 18 verses today. But lesson number 9, if you need that, there should be just a handful of copies in the back. If they're not on the table, maybe check in that little trifold shelf right next to the table in the back. Otherwise, let's be turning our Bibles to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. So once again, the sheet you're getting today, lesson number 10, is going to be for next week. So take that lesson, and that's going to cover verses 19 through about verse 24, where Jesus is talking about treasure and loyalties. We have the probably one of the more memorable verses about you can't serve God and mammon. That's part of that. Lay your treasures up in heaven, not on earth. That's all next week. But today we have Jesus and performance religion. We have 3 examples of that. So Matthew 6, verses 1 through 18, that's lesson number 9. And we're just going to follow the lesson notes we gave out last week. Thank you, man. Appreciate that. Don, Dad, thank you for handing those out. Okay, so let's begin like we normally do. Let's read the section, and then we're just going to follow the discussion questions for this section, verses 1 through 18, and then we'll have your input, a number of things to discuss under each of these questions. So let's begin with verse number 1. Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds. You may have almsgiving, if you have King James or older, before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you pray, go into your room. When you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathens do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Therefore do not be like them, for your Father knows the things that you have need of before you ask him. In this manner, therefore, pray, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear to men to be fasting. Surely I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Now, it's a lot. 18 verses is normally more than we would cover in a single session, but you really just have three big illustrations of the same point in these 18 verses. So we're going to follow your discussion questions. And the first one is this. On your lesson 9, your notes, it'll say, Jesus is still contrasting the true teaching of God against the abuses by the hypocrites, although the style obviously changes. What does he mean in this section? And is he opposed to almsgiving, prayer, or fasting? What are your thoughts on this section? It's obviously different now. The style is very different. We're not doing the, you've heard that it's been said, but I'm saying to you. So there's obviously a change in the way he's approaching these subjects. But what's going on in these 18 verses? Yeah, go ahead, Joel. Sure. Absolutely. Yes. That's right. Right. Yeah, so, and we're going to see a constant theme in this section. What Joel's talking about, it was all for show. They put all these things on the outside to make themselves look religious. And you kind of see that in the illustrations that Jesus is using, because they're really the object of the illustration in the almsgiving and prayers and the fastings. They are the subject matter of those illustrations. Don't be like the hypocrites, because look what they do. It's all for pretense. They're not really doing it for real. They're just outwardly showing you, that to try to garner attention, make you think that they're very religious, but they're not really that way. Have we really left in these illustrations? Have we really left the thought from verse 17 through 20 where he said, let your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees? Let it be more than that, because what they do is just pretense and hypocrisy. Can you kind of still see that same theme in this section? Yeah, it's here. The illustration is very much the same. It's just the style of presenting it is different. It's not the you've heard that it's been said, but I say, and he's contrasting law with practice. He's just directly pointing to some of the practices of the hypocrites here. Any thoughts on this before we start digging in? Any other things that you found? That's it. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So we still have this contrast. Yes, I'm sorry, Philip. Go ahead. Didn't see. Mm-hmm. Right. 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 Yeah, so I think that's a good illustration. Do good works, but don't do it for the praise of people. And so you kind of see that in this section. So we definitely have in this section the continuation of this contrast between true religion and pretentious piety, where these people they were just play actors, and it didn't mean anything to them other than their power, but it wasn't real, it wasn't genuine, like you've been saying. So he's offering these three examples, all under the heading of don't do this before men, to be seen by men. Now, we've got a question coming up about this in just a second. But does this mean, and Philip kind of alluded to this, is Jesus saying that when you practice religion, it can never be seen by people? Is that what he's saying? Certainly not. And I know some folks who read this and say, you can never really practice religion before people, and it's like they're secret agents with their Christianity. You just never know they're Christians, and they're like, well, we're hiding it from people. That's not what he's talking about here, right? And we have some verses on that. We're going to see those verses in just a minute, but we've already seen one in the Sermon on the Mount, because he told us to be something to the world. In fact, he told us to be two things to the world. You remember? Salt and light. So it can't be that he's saying, I don't want you to do anything before people. But he qualifies it. He goes, to be seen by men, right? Which is the qualification, which means your motivation cannot be to receive the glory of people. You do what you do because it's right, but not in order to garner the glory or the attention of people. And this is an amazing word. I tell you what, if you're ever studying with someone and it's all about your conversation is about worship and things you're doing in worship, this is such a telling word on what God thinks about a certain practice going on in our culture today. If you look at this phrase, when it says, verse 1, it says, you do your deeds before men, and then it says, to be seen by them. And you'll see that same phrase, to be seen by them. You'll see it with the prayers, you'll see it with the almsgiving or the charitable deeds, and then you'll see it again in fasting. He uses that same phrase, to be seen by men. It's a form of the word, and I only say this, I'm not saying it to make myself seem smart because I'm not. I'm not trying to be geeky and technical. But there's an English word we get out of the Greek word, and the word here is theatonai. Do you hear an English word in that? Theatrical. And the Lord says, do not be theatrical. What's that tell you about theatrical religion and worship? How's the Lord feel about it? You don't do it, because the entire purpose of theatrical religion is to gain whose glory? Men's glory. And the Lord said, you better not do that, because I want the glory, and don't do anything you do to be seen by men. So there's a condemnation about performance religion in this passage, because true religion is always aimed at pleasing God. It gives little regard to men. Now, obviously, it's not like we're not trying to be repulsive to people and purposefully like sandpaper, but we do what we do because this is what God requires, regardless of how people feel about it in contrast. So this idea of putting on a show or entertaining people or this insincere religion is all aimed at the applause from men, but our aim should be the applause of God in the sense that He's our audience. Yeah, Kevin? It does, yeah. Yeah, two-faced. Right. Yeah, and that's exactly right. That's right. Yeah. So if you didn't hear Kevin, and that word itself goes back to theatrics, because it was like I thought the word just meant a play actor. You know, you're pretending to be something in a play when you're not in reality that thing. So that's a very good point too. So in this passage, he uses. I'm reading New King James, so it says charitable deeds, almsgiving, King James, and it has you have prayer listed and fasting. Is the Lord condemning these practices? Is He saying, don't do almsgiving, don't do prayer, don't do fasting? That's not what He's saying, right? Okay, so we know it's not. It's the pretentious form of these things. It's not the actual practice of these things under consideration. As a matter of fact, He's not doing the same contrast in style where He's saying, you've heard that it's been said, but I say. He's not doing that anymore. But He's still contrasting what the law really taught versus what they were doing, because did the law regulate their almsgiving? Did it have something to say about prayer? Did it also have some examples of how to perform fasting in the Old Testament? And they still weren't getting it right, even in these things. So let's just take a look at some of these things. And what's interesting is when we start reading these Old Testament passages, focus on not the act, because the act, it's indisputable that these are okay to give and to pray and to fast. They're okay. But let's focus on the motive that should have been the motive behind these things. So let's go back to Leviticus 25. What about almsgiving? Benevolence. Let's go back to Leviticus 25. Leviticus chapter 25. So almsgiving is it's giving, including within that. That's all in the realm of benevolent type of help. You're helping people benevolently. You're giving. Look at verse 35. This is one of those, they just forgot to read the rest of the verse when they practiced this. Verse 35. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him, like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, But fear your God, that your brother may live with you. You should not lend him your money for usury, that's with interest, nor lend him your food at a profit. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. And so there were certainly principles about giving and being benevolent, but what was the aim of that? What was the purpose of it? What should have been their goal in offering assistance? To help, right? To help somebody. And that's what they had forgotten, right? It had just become a show, and they had left off that there was real purpose behind almsgiving, which was offsetting the needs of other people. And then eventually, in a grander purpose, if we read through, verse 38, which we did, ultimately, whose character are they trying to mimic? The Lord's character, right? Because he brought them out of the land. He didn't have to do that, but he did it to help them. And now they're supposed to, in turn, help other people. So when they were to give alms, the entire purpose of that was to show the character of God in their actions and then genuinely help somebody. And they weren't trying to help anybody in their almsgiving. Let's look at Deuteronomy, just one more. Deuteronomy chapter 15, since we're in the Old Testament. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 15. Verse 7 beginning. And this is going to sound a lot like what we just read in Leviticus. Deuteronomy chapter 15, beginning in verse 7. If there is among you a poor man of your brethren within any of the gates in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor shut your hand from your poor brother. But you shall open your hand wide to him and willingly lend him sufficient for his need, whatever he needs. Beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry out to the Lord against you, and it become a sin among you. You shall surely give him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your works, and in all to which you put your hand. For the poor will never cease from the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to your poor and your needy in your land. And reading that, he very specifically says, don't you dare make excuses why you can't do that. You do it. And don't just open your hand, but open it how? You open it wide. You generously give, and don't be grieved in your heart. In other words, you do this with joy. You let your heart be grateful for the opportunity to do this. So God had a lot to say about almsgiving and giving in benevolent ways in the Old Testament, but it was never for show. It was always with the intent of helping offset the needs of other people. What about prayer? Same thing. Prayer is the same way. Psalm 145. If we go up to Psalm 145. 145 Psalm. And many of the songs of David are essentially, they're just prayers put to music. That's essentially how they were written. Then let's listen to verse 8. The Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger, great in mercy. The Lord is good to all. His tender mercies are over all his works. All your works shall praise you, O Lord, and your saints shall bless you. And that type of language is pretty consistent in David's psalms / prayers. And they're all aimed at acknowledging God's help and acknowledging his salvation. In fact, if we were to go through a laundry list of verses in the Old Testament where we have prayers being made or supplications being offered to God, in almost all of them there is an indication of our dependence upon God, a recognition of his help for us, his favor that he lends toward us. We just see that all over. And when we get to the New Testament, it's exactly the same. So it's never been about the prayer, and it's never been about the almsgiving. It's about the purposes for which those things are done. And the same with fasting. Now, fasting is an interesting thing. It was more regulated in the Old Testament, not so much in the New. But what was always the purpose of fasting? Was it for dietary reasons that people fasted in the Old Testament? Why did they do it? Okay. It was always about prioritizing, right? It was always about setting aside something that did not have the same priority as whatever God's mission was at hand. It was never about, can I do this to lose weight, or Let's see how long I can do this to prove to myself that I've got the ability to do this. It's not what it was about. It was about whatever was going on was much more important than a meal at the time. And it wasn't, they weren't starving themselves in doing that. They were just setting aside eating for a while until they got the job done, whatever it was. And you see that several times in the Old Testament. A great example of that, I didn't write that in my notes, I was thinking out loud, was remember Esther? Mordecai comes to her and he says, look, I've discovered a plot to kill the Jews. You've got to go tell Xerxes about this. And she says, I've not been invited. He'll kill me if I walk in. He said, but who knows whether God raised you for such a moment as this? And she says, tell the people, she tells them two things. She said, you go tell the people to pray for me and fast. And the next day she goes. It wasn't like a month later and no one had eaten for a month. It was just overnight they did this. And so they set aside meals and they just spent that time in prayer. It was always about affliction of the soul for a moment to prioritize the greater purposes of God. It's connected with humility, the chastening of the soul. Sometimes you see people fasting in the reception of God's word. Sometimes they were sorrowful and they fasted in that moment. But in all of those, God was the priority of that. It was never for show. It wasn't to openly look like, hey, you've not eaten for a month. What's wrong with you? You must be really righteous that you've set aside eating for a month to do the will of God. It was never about that. So we know that in this passage, this is not about the Lord condemning almsgiving, fasting, or prayer. So here's question number 2. And we've kind of lapsed over some of this, but what is the common theme? This is your question number 2. What is the common theme in the actions of the hypocrites? What are their actions intended to do? And based on the language of the text, can we detect anything about the customs? And Joel kind of alluded to some of their customs a little bit earlier. Can we tell anything about why they were doing what they were doing? And then what were some of the customs that the Lord kind of reveals to us about how they were presenting their religion? So why did they do it? We kind of already answered that. Yeah, to be seen of people, if for really no other reason. In fact, he says that they do it to be seen of men. So their actions were really insincere, truly. They weren't really giving, and they weren't really praying, and they weren't really fasting. They were just pretending to and accepting praise as if they had done those things. They wanted to come across as righteous when in truth they were not righteous at all. It didn't really mean anything to them. Art? That's exactly what that was how I was going to respond. I think there's a fine line because it does make you feel good for people to say, hey, you're doing a good job. That's a good thing. And there's a fine line between that and then just wanting to be praised for doing it. I don't know. It's a fine line. I think we all struggle with that to some degree. Gloria? Yeah, it does. If that's the reason, and it is about motive, right. And it's one thing if somebody comes up and says, hey, I just want to tell you you're doing a good job, and your motive has been pure, that's one thing. But I think what Art is saying is also true, that sometimes, we have to guard against just doing something in order for somebody to pat us on the back and say you're doing a good job, when in fact that's all we wanted. That was our reward. In fact, Jesus says that. And to me, that's scary language when the Lord says, if that's what they want, they've got their reward. That's scary. Because that's not the reward any of us want. We want something better than that. We want heaven in the end. So let's look at these 3 examples, and we have there's a little bit of custom presented to us. We get to see a picture of maybe some of the things these guys were doing to sort of garner this attention. Let's take almsgiving. In the first 4 verses, if we go back and look at almsgiving, so you have almsgiving verses 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you kind of get a sense, especially in verse 2, what might have been a customary practice when it came to almsgiving. Do you see something about what that might have looked like in real life back then? Okay, now when he says, don't blow a trumpet like they're doing, were they really blowing trumpets? Or is that's sort of hyperbole, isn't it? And I think Kevin exactly explained it. They were just announcing it really loudly, right? They were just making a big show. about this. They were making a lot of noise so that everybody would be looking at them when they did these things. What's interesting is you have this transition, you have this period between Old Testament, New Testament. During the intertestamental period, a lot changed with the Jews during that time. And to the Jews, by this time in the first century, almsgiving was seen as the most sacred act of righteousness. It was seen by them as the most important thing that you could do, even before prayer and fasting. In fact, there was a rabbinical saying in one of their writings that says, "Greater is he who gives alms than he who offers sacrifices." We've been studying the scheme of redemption. How important was sacrifice? It was the connection to redemption. And yet they had said, sacrifice, yeah, you could leave that off as long as you're almsgiving. And you could see how their priorities had shifted and maybe some of how they'd done that. But here he says in verse 2, he says, in the synagogues and in the streets. Now what's common about both of those places? Highly trafficked, very public areas, okay? And the Lord's going to contrast that by saying, when you do it in your secret place, right? And again, that doesn't mean it can never be seen by people, but he's saying that they specifically chose these areas to do this. And I think we've illustrated before, I think when we talked about the widow with 2 mites and she puts it in, that there was a pretty common practice back then. They had these they were like hammered brass coffers that they sat all over the temple in Jerusalem. That's almost in every spot there was like a receptacle for money, and they would take, it would be like us going, we're going to give $10 on Sunday. Let's say I'm going to give $10, and I go to the bank and I'll say, I'll take $10 in pennies. I want pennies. Instead of just putting a $10 bill in, the plate comes by and I go, do you think everybody in this auditorium is going to notice me putting money in? Yeah. And back then people went, wow, what righteous people they must be to give all that money. And in truth, they weren't really giving much. It was just they'd taken smaller denominations of that, and so they're going in the streets and they're going to the synagogues, and they're not putting in proportionately. They're just putting in a lot of smaller change. But he said they do that so that people will look at them and think, my, what righteous people they are. And so we know that was a pretty common practice of those people back then. Now, we have also prayers, and we get a little bit more insight to prayer. Look down in verse 5 beginning. So they pray standing in the synagogues, do the same things, on the corners of the streets that they may be seen of men. And then down in verse 7 it says, when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathens do. So we have a little bit of insight as to what might have been the public practices of these people. And Jesus said they do this, again, in public places. They are in intentionally conspicuous spots when they do this. And every single time, I can't get this image out of my mind, every single time I read this verse, like verse 5, when it says they pray standing on the corner of the streets, the first thing that pops in my mind is if you walk downtown, Chattanooga, and every town's got it, but if you walk downtown somewhere during the day, there's going to be somebody standing on a corner of a street screaming at people as they go by. And screaming Bible at people. And they'll hold up a Bible and they're just screaming at people as they go by. And people laugh at those folks. That's the image in my mind. They're just intentionally conspicuous, and they stand there doing that. Jewish sources tell us that men would stand as many as 3 hours in a single place uttering a prayer so that people would see that. And it says in their sources they would only become vocal when people walk by. So they just stand there. And when somebody, became visible, then they just, pump up the volume and then start the prayer. And then when they'd pass by, they'd just stand there for 30 minutes or so until somebody would pass by. And I think the connection to verse 7 tells us what they were also doing. And I know he says the heathen, but he says vain repetitions. And of course he uses heathens because a heathen would pray to a pagan deity, right? A non-existent deity. And they would just have to pray because he never an answer, and so they just have to pray often. But I think the Jews probably were guilty of this too, that they would just say the same things over and over and over again to appear righteous. And Jesus said, don't do that. So we have some insight as to what they were doing. And then on fasting, if you drop down to verse 16, notice in verse 16 he says, they disfigure their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. Now, how would you do that? How would that work exactly? How could you disfigure your face to appear like you were fasting? Yeah, facial expressions. Any other thoughts on that? That's, yeah. Don't take a shower. Just get up with messy hair and walk right out. Yeah. Yes, I think that's some of it. So they had this. They sad countenance to me. They made their face, just mopey and let their jaw drop. And we have a little bit of insight into that in some writings that they would put dust on their face. It's like Art was saying, you wouldn't wash your face, but they just take a scoop full of dirt and put it on their face and rub some water on it, make it look like tears had been coming down. Ash they'd put on their heads. They had a practice back then of wearing extremely irritating animal hair, like camel hair or something, against their skin so that they would seem agitated, and there were some accounts that many of them would try to rub it on their face to hope for allergic reactions to appear just red-faced and puffy, like they had been doing that, and they would try to irritate their skin and cause discomfort. They would allow their hair and their beards to be very unkempt, ungroomed, and they would wear clothes that were sometimes associated with fasting. Like today, if you wore black clothes, somebody would think maybe you've been to a funeral. And they would do the same thing with clothing back then. They would particularly do this on purpose so that somebody would say, "My, what a righteous person you are! You must be so righteous as to do this." And so they did these things, but it was all a facade. Now, let's get to number 3 on the question. How do we harmonize the Lord's instruction to work in secret with His earlier commandment to let your light shine? And you sort of answered this. Like in verse 4, He says, do your charitable deeds in secret, in the secret place. In verse 6, He says, go to your room, shut the door, and your Father who sees in the secret place will reward you openly. Then in verse 18, He says, to your Father who is in the secret place. How do we harmonize? Because I think this goes back to what Art was saying just a few minutes ago. I think there's a fine line between doing what's right because it's the right thing to do and people patting you on the back for that, and then just seeking reward. How do we do this? Because at some point people are going to see us doing what we ought to be doing. So how do we balance that? Any thoughts further on that, Joel? I agree. Yeah. Yep. I think that has to be it. Yeah. I think that's it. I think it's just doing the right thing. We purposefully don't want, and I think there almost has to be the desire of, I don't want people, I don't want people to come and applaud me for what I'm just going to do it because it's the right thing to do. And I think that has to be our attitude, and that gets us to where Joel was talking about, just doing the right thing. People will notice it, obviously. It's no way it can't be not noticed, but we don't want people. We're not out looking for people to say something. Steve? Yeah, and I think so. And I think it goes back to what Gloria was talking about too, about it's about motive. It's about the heart. Kevin? Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yes, and I think we have to do that. If we, like in every case where Paul, when he's writing and somebody's saying, "Oh, Paul," he'll say, "But this is God. God gave me God gave me grace, and He's blessed me, and I'm doing this." And I think we should do exactly the same thing. In this passage, when he says, and all 3 of them, he says, do this in the secret place. What is the secret place, really? It's the heart. It's the heart. So, it's exactly what Gloria was talking about earlier. It's all about motive. Let's let our motive be right. Let the motive be right. And whatever else happens, but the motive has to be right. So that's the secret place. We should give to please God. We should pray in order to please God. And if we fast, we should fast in order to prioritize the work of God. And I think people, like Joel said, I think people will always see true discipleship. It's never not going to be seen. But we should never practice anything for the applause of people. We should never do that. Okay, real quick. Number 4. To me, there's nothing terribly, there's 3 really vivid illustrations. There's nothing terribly difficult about the illustrations. But we do have, within these illustrations, verses 9 through 13, where in the heading on mine says, the model prayer. And I think most versions will say something like that. If you've got some sort of superscription and translators have put something in there, it will say, the model prayer, right? So here's question number 4. What is the point of the Lord's instruction in verses 9 through 13 on this prayer? And is this a prayer that we should be saying verbatim today? So let's take the first part of that. Why did he pause in the middle of this instruction to list this prayer and say this prayer to the disciples? Why does he do that? It's got to fit somehow. What's the point of that? Okay, so honor, praise, and he's certainly confirming authority. Our Father who's in heaven. So all of it goes back to God. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah. Teach us to pray. Is this where he's saying, let me tell you about the hypocrites. Oh, by the way, let me tell you how to pray. And then he goes back and he goes, now when you pray, go back and pray it in secret. Do you think he did that, or is this connected somehow to what he's telling them? Is it connected? Yes. Okay. There's no flaring words. Do you think when a person when he's teaching us how to talk to our Father who's in heaven, that immediately becomes very personal, doesn't it? Very sincere. And when he's teaching us, look at the things he's telling us about. For example, verse, hallowed be your name, right? So the reverence is due to God. Where is that shifting the praise automatically at the beginning? Right back up to heaven, right? And so things like this, your kingdom come, your will be done. Where's the focus? It's not on me, it's on God. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So daily bread, where's that provision coming from? God. Everything he says, the focus of that thing shifts us right back to God. There's a reason for him putting this in this conversation. It's not like he just forgot and all of a sudden he's now, let me tell you some things you ought to be thinking about in prayer. It's purposeful to remind them that prayer should always be about God and never about us. Yes, Kevin? Yeah, as a vain repetition. It's just mindless. People say it mindlessly. Now, there's a lot of really great things in this prayer, but and these are all things that we should be very concerned about. These are things that we should incorporate every day. There's a lot more things that we can pray about, but I did want to, at the very end, it says, getting to what Kevin said, is this the thing that we should be saying verbatim? There's a lot of really great things in this prayer, but there's some things that, honestly, we can't quite say anymore. And here's one of them in really the one thing we shouldn't. In verse 10, when he says, your kingdom come. At this point, when Jesus said, like John the Baptist, the kingdom is at hand, what was he talking about? The church. Okay? So I can't pray today, Lord, please establish your church, because the church is here, right? But my concern can still be for the kingdom. I should be concerned for the church. Just the way I word that has to be different. But the Lord's point in this prayer is that I need to be concerned about God, and he needs to get the praise, and if it's a reference to myself, it's just me giving glory back to God. And that was the problem in the first century. They were concerned about glory for themselves, and everything we do should be trying to send attention back to our Father in heaven. So we did make it through this section. I didn't think it was, I thought we could, 18 verses. So next week, God and mammon. You can't serve both. You can only serve one, because you either love the one or hate the other, and therefore put your treasures up in heaven. Do some research. I can't wait to hear what you come up with on that section, and we'll talk about that next week. Matthew 6, verses 19 beginning. Thank you. Appreciate it.